How are you?
Welcome to the American Whistleblower Tour. Woo! Yay! This is just a quick reminder, if everybody could silence or turn off their cell phones, that would be amazing. Again, there will be a question and answer period at the end, so hold all your questions, write them down, take little notes, so you can ask them at the end. And welcome again, and please enjoy this amazing event.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to Westchester University and the Government Accountability Project's Collegiate Whistleblower Tour. I'm glad to see you all here for what I believe will be an amazing event. I'm Jana Nesselrode. I'm a faculty member in the Department of Criminal Justice at Westchester University. This past winter, I offered a seminar class entitled Traitors and Whistleblowers, a course that addressed the sharp distinctions between traitors and whistleblowers and studied the phenomenon of whistleblowing. Both Tom Drake and Bill Binney agreed to speak to my class. We opened the class to others and had a standing room only event, so we had to bring them back to speak to the entire campus community. So I have had the honor of meeting both Bill Binney and Tom Drake, and I'm thrilled that you will all have this opportunity as well. In my department and at Westchester, we work hard to instill in our students the importance of honesty, integrity, and impeccable ethical behavior. But as we all know only too well, we hear about corruption, fraud, and waste by our government and corporate leaders all too often. We learn about this corruption, fraud, and waste largely from individuals whose sum and courage I can only admire and risk their careers and their financial security and even their marriages to step up to the plate and tell us all the truth. This afternoon, we will have the extraordinary opportunity to meet two of these courageous individuals who care more about their country than themselves. They come here today under the auspices of the Government Accountability Project. GAP is the nation's leading whistleblower protection and advocacy organization. A nonpartisan public interest group, GAP litigates whistleblower cases, exposes wrongdoing to the public, and promotes legislation to protect government and corporate whistleblowers. Since its founding in 1977, it has helped over 5,000 whistleblowers. GAP's American Whistleblower Tour, Essential Voices for Accountability, is a dynamic collegiate tour that seeks to educate the public, particularly university students, about the phenomenon of whistleblowing. Westchester University is joining the ranks of such prestigious universities as Stanford, Princeton, Rutgers, Auburn, Brandeis, Temple, Syracuse, and many law schools who have hosted this tour. We are also honored to have with us today Kathleen Mcclellan. Ms. McClellan serves as the National Security and Human Rights Counsel for the Government Accountability Project. She supports national security and intelligence community whistleblowers with a focus on issues of torture, surveillance, and excessive secrecy. She has represented whistleblowers from the National Security Agency, the Central Intelligence Agency, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the Department of Defense, and the Department of Homeland Security. She represents their interests in such forums as the Offices of Inspectors General, the Merit System Protection Board, the Office of Special Counsel, and even in federal courts. She has appeared on numerous television and radio programs and has co-authored an important article I encourage you all to read called The Criminalization of Whistleblowing. She will be educating all of us today about this phenomenon and moderating the ensuing discussion. There will be time for questions and answers at the end of this program, so I ask you to reserve your questions until then. Please welcome Kathleen Mcclellan.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you for that wonderful introduction. Thank you to Westchester University and to Professor Nesselrode, who's been especially instrumental in making this event possible. As Professor Nesselrode said, GAP was founded in 1977 in the wake of the release of the Pentagon Papers by Daniel Ellsberg. GAP's mission is to promote government and corporate accountability by protecting whistleblowers and turning their disclosures into effective reform. We provide legal representation to whistleblowers, we advocate for better legislative and administrative remedies for whistleblowers, and we educate the public about whistleblower issues. And I think the first question we need to answer today is, who is a whistleblower? It's a question that has been especially in the minds of the public consciousness, since Edward Snowden revealed the National Security Agency's mass surveillance programs. And the legal definition is actually quite simple. A whistleblower is someone who discloses what they reasonably believe to be government or corporate illegality, waste, fraud, abuse, mismanagement, or a danger to health and public safety. And for the record, Edward Snowden undoubtedly meets this definition. There's no one profile for a whistleblower. Our clients have brave men and women of all ages, all races, all educational backgrounds, of all levels of government and corporations. Most whistleblowers have the public interest in mind when they make their disclosures, but that's not a requirement to qualify as a whistleblower. The term is attached to someone when their disclosure reasonably evidences wrongdoing. Unfortunately, the experience most whistleblowers have, the experience they have most in common is the retaliation they face. At GAP, we've seen whistleblowers demoted, ostracized, blacklisted, given adverse performance ratings, referred for psychological evaluation, physically threatened, and fired. The latest and greatest threat to whistleblowers, which you'll hear about today, is that national security whistleblowers are being criminally investigated and prosecuted under the Espionage Act. The Espionage Act is an arcane World War I era law meant to go after spies, not whistleblowers. When the government charges a whistleblower under the Espionage Act, it has the intended effect of alienating the whistleblower, sometimes from his or her family, almost certainly from his or her coworkers, or unfortunately often former coworkers, and from their natural allies in the government and open government communities. The government is able to target national security whistleblowers with the Espionage Act because they have no legal protections. They have no ability to sue in federal court to get their jobs back. All of those fora that you just heard, most national security whistleblowers are exempt from using those fora. There's no whistleblowing or public interest defense to an Espionage Act charge. This sounds very depressing, but what's encouraging is whistleblowers are still coming forward in increasing numbers. And when we read about Edward Snowden in the history books, the important precluding chapter will feature Bill Binney and Tom Drake. And I know they're who you're all here to hear from, so I'm going to do a brief introduction, and then we'll hear from the experts.
Bill Binney is a former NSA crypto mathematician who spent over 30 years at the agency. He was a technical director of the World, maybe Bill, can you say your title? I always have to.
Yeah, that was the World Geopolitical and Military Analysis and Reporting Group, which is about 6,000 analysts. They were doing all the reporting and analysis for comment, that is, communications between people in the world.
You can see why I always botch his title. It's much more than that, but he developed a revolutionary information processing system called ThinThread. NSA rejected it. It was too efficient and too effective and too cheap and protected too much American privacy. Instead, NSA sunk its money into a money pit called Trailblazer,
which I think amounted to a series of PowerPoints in the end, to put it generously, wasted billions of dollars and invaded Americans' privacy. Bill didn't let this happen. He filed a complaint through the internal channel of the Department of Defense Inspector General. That made him a target of a federal criminal investigation during which his home was raided by the FBI, and he was put under the specter of criminal prosecution for years.
He finally got a letter of immunity after 3 years of being criminally investigated in 2010. Thomas Drake was a former senior executive official at the National Security Agency. He reported first inside the agency and then to Congress and finally to a reporter massive NSA mismanagement and funding of a data collection program that was expensive and ineffective.
He has a long history of government service, decades of government service. He never shared classified information with the reporter or anyone else. He never violated any oath. He was loyal to the United States and upheld his oath to protect and defend the Constitution. However, he was persecuted by the U.S. government. His house was raided by the FBI. He was charged under the Espionage Act, a law meant for spies. He was threatened with spending the rest of his natural life in prison and faced 35 years. After spending, I'm not even sure, I want to estimate how much on a criminal defense.
In June of 2011, the criminal case against him collapsed in spectacular fashion under the weight of the truth.
The judge held that none of the information that he was accused of illegally retaining, not disclosing, of illegally retaining was not actually classified, and the case received negative press attention in the weeks leading up to trial. He accepted a plea deal to a minor misdemeanor, the equivalent of spitting on the sidewalk at NSA, and the judge admonished the Justice Department for putting him through what the judge called 4 years of hell. In 2011, he also received the Rittenhauer Prize for Truth-Telling. It's the most prestigious award an American whistleblower can receive. Edward Snowden will receive it in April. So please welcome Bill Binney and Tom Drake.
So let's get to it.
Okay.
Bill, could you talk a little bit about when you began working for NSA? What did you hope to accomplish?
What did you see as the agency's mission, and what changed, and when did that happen?
Well, I started back in the 60s. I first went into the military. The military got me into the SIGINT business. See, it's not just NSA. It's NSA CSS, the Combined Security Services. That means it's the SIGINT branches of all the military, the Army, Navy, Air Force, and Marines. So I was in the Army Security Agency, which is the Army branch of the SIGINT CSS, of NSA CSS. So that got me into SIGINT, and so I started there and got into working the Soviet Union, which at the time seemed to be a proper thing to do, since they were our major adversaries at the time, and certainly the biggest threat that was in the world that we were opposing. So I felt that everything I was doing there was quite proper in terms of defending this country and the free world. And in fact, I still do. I mean, everything we did there was proper and within the charter of NSA, which was to do foreign intelligence. And so I started that in 1960 in the military, and then when I broke a few systems, I had an aptitude for the puzzle breaking, so I was solving a few puzzles, code systems and data systems and things like that, and NSA looked at that and thought that was great. They wanted me back there, so right after I was serving in Turkey at the time, they pulled me out of Turkey and sent me back to NSA, and then after I finished my tour in the military, I converted into a civilian at NSA, and that was in 1970, about April, I believe. So, and then from there on, I just continued working the Soviet Union and expanding my view and analytic efforts against a wider range of targets, crypto systems and data systems, code systems, and things like that across the whole Soviet Union, the Warsaw Pact. So that was basically my background and what got me up to be the technical director of the world. So that was a funny title, but at any rate, I thought. So I always had a lot of fun because it was really intense work solving these puzzles. It really takes a lot of energy and focus to do it, and you really get absorbed in it. It's a much more intense process than it is designing the reverse of designing a crypt system. So that was what got me into the business, and that's what I really enjoyed. So.
You need to fix your mic.
Oh.
I think it needs to be moved closer.
Move it up. Okay. Is that better? I think so. That's better. Okay.
Sorry.
Oh, you didn't miss me with that.
So at some point, things changed. When was that? What happened? What did you see happening to the agency that you've been working at?
Well, you see, when I became the technical director of the world, if you will, it's a short title. Well, I was looking at technical problems around the world, what the analysts were facing and what we had to try to solve, and the major one that I saw was dealing with massive amounts of data. And so I started working on that. That's where I started the design of how is it to be able to look at terabytes of data going by, see into it, and see what it is in there that you would you want to pull out for your analysts to analyze the material that's relevant to the targets they're trying to work. I mean, if you pull out, like they're doing now, using dictionary select type terms like Google searches, I mean, those are pathetic searches. I mean, think of the millions of returns you get on any Google return query. You get so many returns you can't get through them all. So you don't know if you missed something as a result. And the same principles is what they were doing, using dictionary select type terminology, going through content, pulling out that content and looking at it that way. Well, that was a destructive approach. It was making them totally incapable of solving any of the problems they needed to address. So the whole idea was now to look into that data and see how I could work or put a system together to be able to pull out only that information that was relevant or was create a rich environment for the analysts to really look at and start to really solve the problems. Well, they still had the same problems today. That's why they missed the bombers in Boston, the shooter in Fort Hood, the bomber in Times Square, the underwear bomber, all of the people who are really trying to do something, they're missing them because they have all of this data that they're buried with them, making them all just dysfunctional. So they never really adopted that, and that was the principle around the systems that I was building, and that's why they didn't like it, because it simplified things and reduced the problems so that they couldn't build an empire or create a budget that would support many contractors and a much larger, like they wouldn't have to build things like Bluffdale, or that big facility, that $2.some billion facility for storage of data, because you wouldn't have to collect it all.
So I have two questions. The first is
Okay.
very quick. What's a terabyte for the technologically ignorant like myself?
Well, you know what a megabyte is? It's 1 million bytes. Then you go to gigabytes, that's a billion bytes, and then the terabytes, 1,000 gigabytes, and then after a terabyte is petabyte, and then exabyte, and zettabyte, and yottabyte. And now if they make the breakthrough in quantum computing for quantum storage, then I figure they have to get the next one, which isn't named that, so I'm suggesting a lot of bytes. So, I thought that was you. So.
And my other question then is much more serious, unfortunately. Okay. So then 9/11 happened.
Yes, yeah.
And everything changed, and nothing changed. And can you explain how that...
Well, I have my theory about why it happened. I mean, it was centered with Bush, Cheney, Hayden, and Tenet. Those were the four who got together and decided, probably around the 15th of September of 2001, that that's what they were doing. They were going to do. It was like 4 days after 9/11, and they were told by Hayden that they had this capacity to basically graph the world, which meant you could build relationships of everything in the world. So they thought, this is the way. I'm pretty sure that Cheney felt that this was. I mean, he grew up with Nixon. Okay, Nixon was after his political enemies. I mean, that's what he did. That's why he had the chaos program at CIA, the Minaret program at NSA, and the COINTEL pro with the FBI. Those were all coordinated programs focused on enemies of the state, that is, people who opposed the Vietnam War, opposed politically what Nixon was doing. That's how he got into Watergate and so on. You know, that's why he was impeached. Well, and now they decided, well, gee, this is really great. We could do the whole world. Well, that meant that now they're doing what Nixon did to get impeached was an infinitesimal of what they're doing now. They're just doing everybody in the country and everybody in the world. So they started this targeting of individuals, everyone. In mid-October of 2001 was when the data first started coming in, and that's when I first found out about it. And I said, well, I can't be a party to this, and I knew right away. I knew all the people at the top at NSA anyway, and I knew that if they wouldn't do this without everybody at the top of the White House and at least the senior people in Congress knowing that this was going on, that's exactly what happened. And so it was pointless to even object to them. The whole idea then at that point in my mind was to take it directly to the intelligence committees who were formed. I mean, all of the intelligence committees, the FISA court, they were all formed after the Church investigation into NSA, the FBI, and CIA back in the 70s. And the fallout was to create these agencies, these committees in the Congress and the court, the secret court, to monitor all the intelligence community agencies to make sure that they weren't spying on U.S. citizens. That was their entire function. And that was the fallout of that Church committee. Well, that was where I took this issue of spying on U.S. citizens The bulk acquisition of data first started with US citizens. And then we went to the rest of the world. So when I go to Germany and talk to people over there, I say, you're being treated just like a US citizen. We're all being treated the same. They're taking in all the electronic data they can possibly get on everybody on the planet. And then they're doing the graphing, which was the technique that I put together. Thank you so much. You know, it's
why would they do that if it doesn't work?
Because they want to target people like the Tea Party, the Occupy group, the religious groups getting politically active, anybody who's a political opponent, or anyone else in the world they want to target. And the FBI especially is using it to do law enforcement. And so is the DEA, the Drug Enforcement Agency.
And Tom, your first day of work at the NSA was 9/11, that's right, I think. Having talked about your case, can you talk a little bit about what it was like at NSA on that day and what NSA chose to do in the immediate aftermath?
By way of quick context, I grew up as a very young teenager during the 1970s. And this was the era of the Pentagon Papers, the bright and shining light of Vietnam, Watergate. We had a president resigning his office, and we had the church and Pike committee hearings exposing for the first time these surveillance programs spying on Americans without a warrant, in complete violation of the Constitution. So it's important to note the country actually has been here before. But as I've said publicly, I'll say it here again, what we're seeing today on an extraordinary scale makes the Nixon era look like pikers by comparison. I had been in the military twice, flying on RC-135s in the Cold War. The country in which, the target country in which I became an expert as a cryptolinguist was East Germany. East Germany was a fascist surveillance state. That's why what's been going on now is I'm particularly sensitive to. If you have not seen the movie, I would encourage you to see The Lies of Others, because it really shows what happens in a surveillance state and what it does to the sovereignty of who we are as human beings. I was in the military, also as a reserve intel officer in the Navy at the Pentagon. I used to sit on the terrorism desk. That's where I first learned about Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda. It's also where I was when they attempted to drop the World Trade Center towers the first time with truck bombs in 1993. I was also at the CIA for a short time. And then I answered an ad in the paper in February 2001. And administratively joined NSA, went through all the processing, took the oath to support and defend the Constitution for the 4th time. And my first day reporting on the job was 9/11. I never imagined that 9/11 would be the trigger, and I'm going to say this here with this audience. I said this last night in Georgetown in the Gaston Hall, where I was on stage with Ray McGovern, Colleen Rowley, Jessalyn Radak, and Daniel Ellsberg. 9/11 was the trigger to suspend the Constitution in the deepest of secrecy. Within a few short days and weeks of 9/11, independent of Bill, although we ended up comparing notes not long after that, much to my horror, I saw Pandora's box opened up, that I was eyewitness to the subversion of the Constitution on an extraordinarily vast scale. And my moment of truth, there's a whole lot that takes place between 9/11 and the first week in October, in which I confronted the lead attorney in the Office of General Counsel at the National Security Agency. By the way, NSA, some refer to it as no such agency. Never say anything. No secrets anymore. At least not ones that you're trying to keep, right? So that confrontation with the attorney, the lead attorney.
What were you confronting him about?
Well, I discovered in the intervening weeks, and also I was on an effort to facilitate under the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act. There's a statute passed in 1978 because of all the abuses that the United States had committed, violated willfully, acts of commission, not omission, against American citizens. I've discovered in those intervening weeks, and I was on an effort, by the way, to help support the FBI in putting together affidavits that would go up before the secret surveillance court, which at that time had a Fourth Amendment standard. You have to have probable cause, first reasonable suspicion, but probable cause to issue a search warrant up or down to actually violate your rights under the Fourth Amendment legally.
Just a bit of legal background. If the FBI wants to get a search warrant on someone in the United States, they can just go to a regular court and get a search warrant. There's lots of exceptions to the warrant requirement, and the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Court is aimed at secret warrants that cover information that's supposed to be gathered pursuing foreign intelligence. That's how it was before 9/11. There's no indication it wasn't working.
In fact, they've been modified 5 times since 1978 to keep up with the technology. What's critical about the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, 2 secret courts, there's an appeals court, House and the Department of Justice, is that it was the exclusive statute by which a U.S. citizen, a resident legal alien, or a U.S. corporation, if they were suspected of engaging in foreign intelligence against the national security of the United States, you would go to the secret court. But you still have to meet the Fourth Amendment threshold standard. There was actual conditions for hot pursuit, meaning if the national security was at such stake, you could still go after hot pursuit, the target, as U.S. person was defined, go after the U.S. person, and then but you would still have to go back to the secret court. I was on an effort that was actually helping facilitate that process, was mysteriously taken off. I also had people coming to me in private saying, what are we doing, Tom? It's a prime directive at the National Security Agency. You do not spy on Americans without a warrant. Why? Because of all the severe abuses that NSA committed, including the first mass surveillance program called Operation Shamrock, which for decades and decades, post-World War II, not revealed until 1975, was routinely sweeping up all telexes coming into and out of the country, and in cooperation with at least 3 corporations, including RCA Global. So it's the first week in October. I have all this extraordinarily disturbing knowledge, gravest of concerns regarding what the United States is doing. I had already gone to my supervisor, the number 3 person at NSA. Here I am speaking directly to the attorney. I says, what are we doing? We're in violation of the Fourth Amendment rights of U.S. persons. He says, you don't understand, Mr. Drake. The White House has approved the program. It's all legal. And as soon as he said it's all legal, the hair on the back of my neck stood up. Because I was thrown back to the 1970s, and it came out in the David Frost interviews with former President Nixon, that if the president says it's legal, it's legal. If the president says do it, it's legal. Here I was confronted by the deep state truth that the White House had approved, in collusion with General Michael V. Hayden, a mass surveillance program of enormous proportions. And it was just legal because they said so. And I pressed him really, really hard. I said, there's a constitutional means in this country by which you change law. He said, you don't understand. If we go to Congress, they'll say no. Then the rest of the hair stood up on the back of my neck. Because I now knew that the government had fully unchained itself from the Constitution. That not only had the wheels come off our form of governance, a constitutional republic, a special form of democracy, we were in an entirely new vehicle that I did not recognize. Remember, I had just taken the oath for the 4th time to support and defend the Constitution against what? All enemies, foreign and domestic. And here I was confronted by the trigger of 9/11, an egregious act, a fundamental failure of the United States government under the preamble of the Constitution to provide for the common defense. A systemic failure, and NSA was also culpable. And he said, you don't want to ask any more questions. And I knew right then and there, moment of truth, right then and there, I could not remain silent. That if I remained silent, that I would be complicit in a crime. That if I remained silent, that I would be turning away from the subversion of the Constitution. That if I remain silent, I be an accessory to the government committing a criminal act. And it's important to note, it's really important to note, and people often forget this, particularly the apologists, those who defend the national security state or the deep state, that if you violate the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, it has criminal sanctions under Title 18 for those students who are in criminal justice. $10,000 fine for every instance of violation, 5 years up to 5 years in prison. And so I started blowing the whistle.
They were only doing a few billion of those a day.
What I didn't know that first week, Kathleen, is that the president had actually signed a secret directive. It was the formal directive. They had already authorized it verbally, as Bill indicated. But the secret directive on 4 October, establishing NSA as the executive agent for what was called the program. The program was the mass surveillance program, and at that time it was referred to, or was under the umbrella name of Stellar Wind.
Stellar Wind. Bill has another name for Stellar Wind.
Yes, would you like me to? I don't have any problem.
Sure, I think we're all friends
I called
here.
it Cosmic Fart. Simply because, it was, well.
So,
I wanted to add one point here. If anybody remembers, Nancy Pelosi, when she was Speaker of the House, got up and said that impeaching George Bush is off the table. Well, part of the reason when they set this program up to spy on U.S. citizens, they wanted to limit exposure and knowledge of it in Congress and also in the courts. So they called it a covert program. And under the law, that meant that they did not have to inform Congress beyond the Gang of 8. Well, initially, all they talked about to in Congress about this program were the Gang of 4, which is the chair and ranking members of the House and Senate Intelligence Committees, who are supposed to be doing the oversight of the intelligence agencies. So they informed them both. Well, the ranking member on the House Intelligence Agency, Agency at the time, was Nancy Pelosi. So she was read into this program and also the CIA programs, rendering and such, so that she was involved in these programs from the very beginning. So that gave George Bush leverage when she was Speaker of the House. So if she wanted to impeach George could say, well, you have to impeach yourself too because you're a part of this. So that was the leverage he had on her, and that's how they co-opt Congress into these programs, slowly with these intelligence committees and just a few people. Yeah.
I'm glad you brought up congressional oversight because I want to step back just a little bit and talk about Thin Thread and Trailblazer and your experience there and your experience with the contractors and with congressional oversight and what happened. And I was wondering, Bill, if you could share a particular meeting that you had with General Hayden after you had gone to congressional oversight, to congressional overseers in the intelligence committees and told them the truth about what NSA was doing, about how much money they were wasting on Trailblazer, and about how effective Thin Thread could be. And just for a little bit of context, this all occurred prior to 9/11. One of the justifications that we hear for these programs is that they could have prevented another 9/11 or that they will prevent another 9/11. And that's patently false. And I think this meeting and that experience prior to 9/11 can explain why.
Well, yeah, what it was the staffers from the intelligence committees came out and we gave them a briefing on Thin Thread and what we were doing and how much we had succeeded at and how well it worked. So that it was basically going. The way Hayden looked at it was that it was a direct threat to the program that he wanted to sponsor, which was a multi-billion-dollar program. A lot of money, a lot of contractors, a lot of contracting agencies involved and people around the community. I called them leeches on the government because that's what they were doing. They were leeching money off the government. They still do it. Their vision statement is keep the problem going so the money keeps flowing. That way they keep alive, Once you build up a big organization, you have to feed it. You have to sustain it. That takes a lot of contracts. So their interest is the next contract, not solving the problem. So, but at any rate, Hayden called us a meeting together, and we got We got shouted at for talking to Congress about what we were doing because it wasn't the corporate position. So in other words, he was saying, corporation has made a decision, follow the line of the decision of the corporation. Don't be creative, don't be innovative. Just do what you're told. And that's exactly the line he took. So some of my friends back in the shop, in the Russia shop, came out with a quote that paralleled what he said. It was done by Ilyich Lenin, a speech he gave in 1906, where he was talking about the party. Once the party decides, follow the line of the party. And it paralleled exactly what Hayden said. So I put those two together as a comparison, and I share it with all the media now too. It's a funny statement, you know. But that said exactly that they didn't want creativity, innovation, or success. They wanted to follow a corporate line, which was to assemble money, build an empire, build many more. They were trading, essentially, my view of it, put simply, was they traded the security of the people of the United States and the free world for money. That's what they did.
In essence, our country at the highest level sold out national security for a profit. And I'll just give you one interesting example. The workforce at NSA knew that we had utterly failed the nation, that we had not kept people, or let alone Americans, out of harm's way. That was our fundamental responsibility in terms of intelligence. And the NSA itself had significant culpability in the 9/11 failure. And yet when we were going around the workforce, myself and the number 3 person that I reported to, the response that she would give was, no, you don't understand. Direct quote, 9/11 is a gift to NSA. We'll get all the money we want and then some. Billions and billions of dollars were poured into NSA after 9/11, essentially doubling what was the existing budget, the program for the record, over the next 18 months. And it's even gone far higher than now. It's in the 11 billion plus range. That's just on the record that's been revealed to date. All this money is part of probably the largest redistribution of wealth in this country we've ever seen. We're in the trillions now that have been spent on some version of national security, homeland security, and it's simply militarizing much of our domestic sphere as well. So it's just important to know that and this is where the other part of my whistleblowing came in, as well as Bill's, is massive fraud, waste, and abuse, where Trailblazer literally became a funding vehicle to make a whole lot of contractors extraordinarily rich. I myself was tempted, and I mean tempted directly, by a number of very senior managers, marketing managers, and others in the military-industrial complex, intelligence complex. Yeah, you're making $150,000 a year, Tom, but you know, if you come over to us, we'll quadruple your salary. Quadruple, and that's before bonuses. People were cashing in big time. We used to joke about everybody bellying up to the Trailblazer bar because there was more than enough money to go around for everybody. And the one thing you did not do is, disturb it. Don't rock the boat. There's more than enough money to go around for everybody. So it's important to note this, that in Congress was literally writing blank checks. I still remember in the fall of 2002, which was the 50th anniversary of NSA, big gala celebration in the cafeteria, the main cafeteria at Fort Meade, the main complex of NSA. And up on stage, when they're given all their awards and presentations, Tim Samples, who at the time was one of the House Intelligence Committee staffers, is handing off, I don't know if they still do it in Pennsylvania, Publishers Weekly, Publishers Clearinghouse. Yeah, Publishers Clearinghouse, the big fake check. They had one of these big fake checks that had, to the right of the digit, and the digit was greater than 1, 9 zeros. Multi-billion-dollar check being handed off by Tim Samples to General Michael Hayden. And I couldn't hear Michael Hayden's words, but he was looking down at the head table, and George Tenet, who was the director of Central Intelligence, and also the director of the CIA, he says, George, I got my money. George, I got my money. Let's also not forget, just as a point of history, name me one government agency that was not brought into existence by congressional legislation. NSA. Literally a secret stroke of a pen by President Harry Truman in 1952. It's a military organization headed up by a military general. It's important to know that. They are ultimately only beholden to the President of the United States under his commander-in-chief role as specified under Article 2 of the Constitution.
I'm glad you reminded everyone that NSA is the Department of Defense agency, because it's the Department of Defense Inspector General who you filed a complaint with. And I think a lot of what we've heard in the wake of the Edward Snowden revelations is that he should have gone through proper channels. And you're about to hear what happened to the men who went through proper channels. The Department of Defense Inspector General has the jurisdiction to oversee NSA. And Bill, if you could tell the audience what happened when you went to the Department of Defense Inspector General.
Well, I mean, they did a 2.5-year investigation with about 12 inspectors. They came out to NSA and did their investigation. Of course, they verified everything we had said in the complaint and more. But then the Department of Defense Inspector General turned over our names to the FBI and said we were the ones who complained. And so then that's when NSA took that, because they were really offended by that. It caused them a lot of embarrassment, right? And you don't want to embarrass NSA because they get really ugly, and that's exactly what they did. And they fabricated things to stimulate the FBI to come at us, which is what they did. So they came in and raided us. In my house, they came in at gunpoint. They had the guns drawn. So
And where were you?
I was a threat, I guess, you know.
Can you describe in detail what happened when the NSA came in?
Well, I wasn't wearing any
I'm smiling,
clothes.
you'll hear why.
I was coming out of I was in the shower, and they came in. A guy came in with a gun, pointed it right at my head. And so, what is this guy doing with a gun pointed at me in my bathroom? So I said, okay, well, I'll help you out. And I said, well, I suppose I can put some clothes on, do you? It's okay. So but after that, I mean, they didn't. I started right away. I started to figure out why they were there. It was intimidation. And the other thing was I started getting angry at them for doing this. Because they already knew through the Stellar Wind program that I had nothing to do with the New York Times report of the warrantless wiretapping or any other data mining program.
Can I pause you 1 second, Bill?
Yes, sure.
To clarify, just for a little context, the reason the FBI raided Bill's house was it was a pretext. It was based on a warrant suspecting Bill and 3 other people who signed the Inspector General complaint, and later Tom, of being sources for a Pulitzer Prize-winning New York Times article that revealed the NSA's warrantless wiretapping program. That was, of course, the tip of the iceberg we know now, but it still caused NSA consternation, to say the least. Bill and Tom were not sources for that article, but what they did do was complain through proper internal channels. So that was the pretext under which they raided Bill's house. They accused them all of being co-conspirators to violate the Espionage Act, also a false accusation that turned out
Well, my point was that they already knew that we weren't involved because they already had all that data with Stellar Wind. There's all the phone calls and emails in the United States. Okay, they had it all. And I've got some slides that if I have a chance, I'll show you where they're tapping the fiber optic lines inside the United States.
So Tom had a bit of a worse experience, if that's imaginable, other than being pulled out of the bathroom with a gun to your
He was
head.
indicted.
Tom was the material witness for the Inspector General. He did not sign the complaint because he still worked at NSA at the time. Bill had retired, and Tom credibly feared retaliation. So he was a material witness for the Inspector General, a confidential witness, he thought, until the Inspector General gave his name to the Department of Justice. So Tom, if you could talk about the raid and the beginnings of your criminal case and how that came about.
In addition, I was a material witness for 2 9/11 congressional investigations. I gave them thousands of pages of documentation, prima facie evidence of the massive fraud, waste, and abuse, the secret surveillance programs, the intel fail, and the cover-up that ensued in terms of what NSA actually knew prior to 9/11. They could have stopped 9/11 all by itself, just so you all know. But it turns out I also got raided. And that was 4 months. And I knew when the Rise in Lickla article was published in the New York Times in December 2005, because the number of people actually knew about the secret surveillance and Stellar Wind program was actually quite small. And I knew it was a matter of when, not if. And in fact, when Bill and the others were raided, I ended up meeting just a couple of days after Bill and one of our colleagues, Kirk Wiebe, and I could tell in Kirk's voice, says, Tom, we need to talk to you. So I met in a little town near where I live in Maryland, and they said, you're next. Because they were asking questions about me. And it was clear that the bullseye now was centered on me, that I had now become the primary target. And it turned out, based on the actual search warrant as well as the affidavit that I was finally able to locate and get from the court several years later, it made it very clear that they thought that I was actually the leaker to the New York Times. The absence of evidence, in spite of Stellar Wind having all the phone calls and all the emails and everything else for that matter, the absence of evidence meant that I really was a really, really good spy and had kept my associations with the New York Times so deeply secret that even the FBI and the NSA could not locate any association, which meant I was really bad. So I'm getting ready to go to work. At that time, I was teaching at the National Defense University, and I'm looking out my bedroom window and I see a dozen FBI agents streaming across the front lawn. So just imagine for the moment what you would be thinking if you saw a bunch of cars pull up and then a dozen FBI agents jumping out and surrounding your home. And the next thing you hear is a really, really loud knock on the door. My son actually opened up the door. He was 12 years old at the time. And interesting enough, he had the presence of mind to say, Pop, there's someone here to see you. Yep. So I come downstairs and I had the presence of mind to ask him for his identification. They didn't like that. I remember him actually showing his FBI badge. And then they just streamed through the house, served me with the search warrant. They spent the next 9 hours tossing my house. I did choose to cooperate. People have asked me why. Why would you want to speak to FBI? Why? There's another opportunity to blow the whistle. But they didn't want to hear about that at all. Took away all my computers and a bunch of stuff.
Actually, just to note really quickly, the FBI agents are obligated to investigate a crime if they have evidence of it, if they hear about it. So the fact that Tom and Bill shared with them crimes and those crimes were not investigated is misconduct on the part of those FBI agents.
And I will say, what I shared with the FBI agents, just like I had within channels for many, many years, over those many, many intervening years, were crimes up to and including high crimes and misdemeanors as defined in the Constitution. This went right into the Oval Office. Although it was primarily the responsibility of then Vice President Cheney.
So 9 hours after they tossed your house, and Bill, did they search your house for the same amount of time?
They got there at 9 in the morning. We were all those who signed the DODIG complaint, the four of us who signed it, Ed Loomis, Kirk Wiebe, Diane Rourke, and myself. We were all raided simultaneously. Diane was living in Oregon at the time, so it's 3 hours time difference. So she got raided at 6 o'clock, we got hit at 9, so they could coordinate it. So we couldn't call one another, if we were getting raided.
And, the reason I'm focusing on this is to just personalize it, and I know you gentlemen are so comfortable talking about it, but what it was like to have strangers digging through your house, your families were there. If you could talk a little bit about that if you're comfortable, and just share what that experience was like for you.
Well, like I said earlier, I was starting to get mad at these people for doing this. So when they were asking me to tell them something that would implicate someone in a crime, basically they were after Tom or Diane Rourke. Those are the two primary targets. I said, well, I couldn't remember anything. I couldn't. First of all, it depended on me to first say what was the crime. So I'd have to say, okay, I know about a crime, and then these are the people that I know about that were involved in it. All those were decisions I had to make. They didn't define the crime for me. So I said I couldn't think of anything that would associate with anybody with a crime, because everybody has the right to free speech, the First Amendment. Certainly the congressional people have the right to talk to reporters. They all do it anyway. So I couldn't see a crime there. So then they said, I think you're lying, and that really got me, okay? So at that point I was really ticked at them. I said, okay, I know what the crime is. I said, George Bush, Dick Cheney, Hayden, and Tenet all conspired to subvert the Constitution, and they all did it with this program called Stellar Wind. It meant they took in all the telecom data that they could get from all the telecoms that would cooperate, and they started mapping out and graphing all the relationships of everybody in the United States, and now they're taking in all the content with the emails and so on. And now they're mapping all that to it. And these are all part of the program called Stellar Wind. It started in October of 2001. Well, see, I caused him a problem. The only thing they could do, the guy who was the only one agent, Paul Marek was the special agent in charge, he was the one who was the only one there that was cleared for this program. The only thing he could do when I was telling this to all the other agents, that's who I was telling it to, by the way, I was causing them a problem, okay? I'll tell you what that is in a minute, but the only thing he could do was look at the floor. This guy knew what he was doing. Right? This is a violation of the Constitution and any number of laws, the Electronic Privacy Act, the Pen Register Law, the Electronic Security Acts, all the FTC regulations governing telecoms, all of those are being violated, as well as the Constitution. He knew that, and all he could do was look at the floor. The rest of these guys were sitting there looking, just staring. And so, before they left my house, I caused him a problem. I exposed the most secret program in the United States to all these agents who weren't cleared. They had no clearance for it. So they could not simply scatter at the end of the raid on my house. They had to meet outside, run in their cars. He called them all together out there. I know, I know exactly what he was saying. You guys cannot go from here and start talking about this program. Because now he had to get them all cleared so that they wouldn't talk about it. You know, but so that was my part at them. So I started coming back at them too at that time, and later, and I still am. So because they're all corrupt, they were all a part of this cover-up. This is a cover-up of the crimes, of high crimes and misdemeanors against the Constitution and the rights of everybody in this country. It's what it is.
The price you pay is extraordinarily high. I had never told my spouse, who works at NSA as a contractor, that I had ever cooperated with any of the investigations. She had no knowledge at all. I had to protect her as well as the rest of my family. All I remember, you can imagine this shock, how scared she looked in her eyes as the FBI comes pouring into our house. Needless to say, the price was pretty high. We were separated. I was headed for divorce. It's never been the same ever again. All of your professional networks, all the people you hang out with, the people you see each and every day are completely gone, shattered. You're now under criminal investigation. I spent the next year plus was extremely lonely. That's an understatement. But it's important to note, in April of 2008, just to show you how serious the government was to destroy my life, and while continuing to place the others and keep them under a criminal investigation. I was in New York City trying to clear my head, recognizing that I was behind several 8 balls and facing a very bleak future. I was asked to go to a secret FBI facility in the greater DC area. And when I got there, they said, "There's someone here to see you." Well, it turned out it was a chief prosecutor. He'd been appointed by the criminal division in the Department of Justice to lead the investigation. It turns out, in terms of this investigation was really serious. They had 5 full-time prosecutors. They had 25 full-time FBI agents. In fact, a number of the FBI agents that were involved in my particular, because they had raided my house, there was a dozen. They had another a half dozen or so that actually raided my office at the National Defense University. This is pretty serious. This is a lot of resources tied up. They actually borrowed the elite of the elite, what they call the Mole Hunter Unit FBI. These are the ones that go after real spies. Okay. So clearly I was more than just a passing spy. They really were after me. So I get there, and it's the chief prosecutor, and he proceeds to threaten me with spending the rest of my life in prison. This is April of 2008, if I did not cooperate with their investigation. He says, "We have more than enough information to put you away for a long, long time. The evidence against you is overwhelming. You better start talking." I cut off all communications at that point. I hired a private attorney. How many of you are willing to spend $550 an hour on a private attorney? Are you willing to spend that much money to defend all the oath that you took, in my case 4 times, rights, our liberties, and our freedoms. Is $550 an hour worth it? I will tell you yes. The problem is, and he did cut me a break of $50 an hour, but it doesn't take long over the next 2 years to exhaust, even though I had substantial liquid assets. Doesn't take too long for all that money to disappear. And you incur all kinds of expenses. And you're now persona non grata. And you can't find a job. I had resigned in April of 2008. And so, long story short, I know Kathleen, you want to go a little bit further with this, but I knew what else could happen. And there was multiple attempts to get me to plead out to many years in prison as a felon. And I continued to refuse to do so. As I told the chief prosecutor, I will not plead bargain with the truth. That the oath that I took to the Constitution took primacy over everything else. I had not taken an oath to the president. I didn't take an oath to lie. I didn't take an oath to cover up. I knew that none of this dark side conduct on the part of the government was necessary. That the very best of American ingenuity, innovation, creativity had already solved the quote-unquote digital age data problem. And we never had to go down that slippery slope. We never had to go into what Frank Church himself warned the nation about back in 1975, what he called the abyss, that with the advances in technology, given what had happened in the intervening decades, where the power of NSA had already been turned on American citizens, he himself said, what would happen with advanced technology? We find ourselves in the abyss. Could we take ourselves out? Could we pull ourselves back? Well, here I was facing that. For simply having held up the mirror, speaking truth to enough power, and I'm on the receiving end of the Department of Justice criminal investigation. And I'm facing spending many decades in prison, simply for calling out the government committing high crimes and misdemeanors against the people. April, they are granted immunity. But do you want to talk about the letter? Go ahead.
I want to throw a little story in before that. I was angry at these people, and over this period of time, from 2007 to through 2009, they were attempting to indict us. They attempted 3 times. The last time was a conspiracy charge. We all met in a Turf Valley club down in Maryland, which was, and our objective there was to try to pull together a team to go after Medicare and Medicaid fraud. So we were planning on attacking that problem. And so they saw us all getting together there. People who we'd worked with were Diane Rourke and Ed and Kirk and myself and Tom. And so we were planning to do that. And they thought, this is a great conspiracy, or we'll concoct a conspiracy around this and charge them with that. So they told our lawyers they were going to indict us on that. So I thought, well, okay. At the same time, I was assembling evidence of malicious prosecution on these people, because I knew they were criminals, okay? It was a matter of time before they'd stumble and bumble. Well, they just did, okay? So I said, well, okay, now how am I going to tell them all the evidence I've assembled on them that will charge them malicious prosecution? When we go into court on their charge, we'll give them a counter charge. So I thought, well, gee, if I call Tom, I know his phone is tapped by the FBI. So that means that if I tell him all the evidence that I have assembled of malicious prosecution against the Department of Justice, right, and the FBI, that they'll at least know that they're going to be countercharged when we go into court. So I told him all the evidence. I called Tom. Tom was quiet. He didn't say anything. And I was, just to be sure that the FBI knew where to find it, I said, well, if you go into the file, the FBI had this file. If they just went into the file, clicked on properties, went down and looked at properties, looked at the date and time, they could see the date and time.
Metadata.
That was when we were at the Turf Valley Club, so they could see the direct evidence of what we were doing there, which was Medicare and Medicaid fraud. So I called on that. I told all that to Tom. And then a month later, we get immunity letters.
And they thought, I think they really thought that by granting you and Kurt immunity letters, that meant that you would now be free, knowing they wouldn't be prosecuted, to then spill the beans on me. There were no beans to spill.
Right, there wasn't anything. I mean, we'd been telling them the truth all along, they just didn't want to believe it. Okay, when you mentally perceive something one way, and this is fundamentally what NSA does too, In the cryptology area, they're linear thinkers. If they're going down this path that has succeeded before, that's the path they want to go down no matter what. Well, you know, when you're doing crypt problems and things like that, or anything else in life, you need to try to be open and receptive to different stimuli and different evidence coming in from all kinds of directions to really arrive at a correct solution. You know, if that's really what you're after. In this case, they weren't. So they had this direct path that they were going down and they weren't going to get off it. So they wanted to they thought we knew something, but we didn't, you know, because there wasn't anything there.
Tom, I wanted to ask you,
Sure.
Since the collapse of the case against him, the case against Tom collapsed in spectacular fashion days before trial. The judge was outraged that they put him through 4 years of hell, which is the judge's words, to charge him with, I think it was exceeding authorized use of a government computer. It's the equivalent of looking at Facebook at work. And you were sentenced to community service. After 5 counts under the Espionage Act, 10 felony counts, all of that was just thrown out and scrapped because it was built on sand. And
Can I say,
sure,
can I add one thing here? This was part that also got me. This is part of the reason I went public on this, because I couldn't stand our corrupted DOJ and FBI, and their governments is so corrupt. They fabricated evidence against Tom. They took papers that he had at home that were clearly typed unclassified at the top and bottom. So they drew a line through it, stamped it top secret or secret, one or the other, and then charged him with having classified material.
they also
that's
unclassified
fabricating evidence.
They also unclassified a document after the indictment. And then they also said that even though a document was marked unclassified, Tom should have known that it was marked wrong and that the information was actually classified. And that was the basis for an Espionage Act charge. And so, Tom, here's my question for you. You know, now 3 years later, after the collapse of your case, even Justice Department officials have said, well, that was a bit of overkill. It was too much. Tom's a real whistleblower. Edward Stone's not. And I just wondered if you could talk about that a little bit and how that makes you feel in contrast with what they were saying back in 2008 when they were threatening you with the rest of your life behind bars.
Well, one, you can't understand Snowden without understanding my case. In fact, you can't understand any of the subsequent Espionage Act cases without understanding my case. There's voluminous filings, public filings in my case that set the floor. I was really the exemplar. They want to make me the example, drive that stake in national security right through me, prop me out of the public comment, and say, this is what happens. See, I was the first whistleblower charged in like manner since Daniel Ellsberg. And Daniel Ellsberg and I got to meet him shortly after I was indicted in April of 2010. But I don't think they would be saying that if I had actually ended up in prison. It's by virtue of having held them off and having kept my liberties and freedoms and my rights, those inalienable rights, amongst which are life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, and several that are actually protected in the first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights of the Constitution. So this idea that Edward Snowden didn't go through proper channels, look, I went through every channel that existed. There were no other channels left. And so there comes a point, I'm the first to acknowledge this, and there is history here to support it. What happens after you bring all of this evidence forward, both classified and unclassified within proper channels, and you find out that it's all censored and suppressed, even within the secret system, and that the system itself, instead of choosing to act on it, to correct itself, even with the existing statutes like the Intelligence Community Whistleblower Protection Act, well, it turned out it was an exposure policy. It was a trigger for retaliation. So many years go by. It's now early 2006. After having exhausted, in the last, other than once again using the opportunity when I was part of the FBI to report high crimes misdemeanors, my last, you say, official whistleblowing act within the system while I was still at NSA before the raid actually took place in November 2005. In November 2005, I wrote a letter to then the director of NSA, General Alexander. That was the trigger that led to the final retaliation, in which I ended up, they reorganized the director of engineering, and I had no job at the end of that reorganization. So goes forward, it's now early 2006. I know that I will ultimately get caught up in this massive criminal leak investigation. As I found out later from an extremely well-placed source, Cheney himself had given the directive between the White House and the Department of Justice to find and fry the leakers. I don't care who it is or who they are, just find and fry them and make examples of them. Because it's important to note that the secret surveillance program is an extraordinarily secret program. The White House, NSA knew, the Department of Justice knew they were in violation of the Fourth Amendment. They had just chosen to suspend it. And it had been that way for many, many years. I had all this dirty knowledge. So now it's early 2006. They've launched this massive leak investigation. I had one final avenue. But that avenue was the third rail option, and that avenue was fraught with extraordinary peril. That avenue was what? Go to the press. And so I went to the press in the public interest with what I knew. Secret surveillance, massive multi-billion-dollar fraud, waste, and abuse, and the intel fail of 9/11, and the NSA had culpability. Now I'm on the receiving end of a 10 felony count indictment, right? For having not only gone through proper channels, but having brought critical information in the public interest to the press so we, the people, can inform ourselves about what's going on within our own government. So if you're Edward Snowden, it's now 2012, 2013. Having seen, he said this publicly, having seen what happened to me and others and Bill Binney and John Kiriakou, do you think that he was going to go through proper channels? They were all exposure policies. In the end, he had to make an even more fateful decision. He also went to the press. But for him to go to the press to ensure that the critical information, the documented evidence he had about how far this mass surveillance program had truly metastasized, that there was a cancer on the body politic, a cancer growing inside the country, feeding off the Constitution, feeding off who we are as Americans and our own sovereignty. Ostensibly to make us feel safe again. Ostensibly for the purposes, this end justifies the means of national security, meaning we are licensed to do anything. If that means up to and including eroding our fundamental liberties and freedoms, so be it. To deal with the existential threat, right? Well, that's precise what happened. He had to escape the United States. One of the things I did share with you is I was placed, during the time I was facing a 10 felony count indictment, facing many decades in prison, I was put under severe travel restrictions. Imagine not being able to leave an area much larger than what's bounded by the greater Philadelphia area, maybe a little bit of Wilmington and parts of New Jersey. To leave that area, that you would have to get special permission from the court, and also knowing that the government had right of first refusal. Do you think that would constrain your freedom of movement just a little bit? And oh, by the way, you can't travel outside the United States because we saw fit to confiscate your passport. Edward Snowden left the country. And things, even since my own case, there's a thing called the National Defense Authorization Act, which actually grants license to the government. If it decides that you're a target, if you're a threat to the state, and they decide to label you providing material support to those who are enemies of the state, whether it's internal or external for that matter, they can literally take you off the street and hold you in indefinite detention. He knew all this, so he had to escape the U.S.
So, Bill, would you agree with that?
Yes. In fact, I had a position that the law should be applied, and Edward Snowden committed a crime. He should be tried for it. But I also believe that the law should be applied equally, which means that we need to go back and try Bush, Cheney, Hayden, Tenet, everybody in the Intelligence Committee, everybody. I would even try the judges in the FISA court, because they've committed crimes. They've issued general warrants, for God's sake. I mean, that's a crime. I mean, also, all the people, not just in the Bush administration, but now the equivalent people also in Obama administration, all of them, they all should be tried. If we're not willing to try them, we shouldn't try Snowden. If we want to try Snowden, we should try them all.
Well, and I'm glad you brought up this idea of trying Snowden. It's one of the things we've heard a lot is he should come back and face trial. Well, Tom, you faced trial. Was it a fair trial?
Look, this is really critical. When I was indicted, and it was made extremely public, you had Lanny Brewer, the head of the criminal division. He was the supervising official in my case, over the chief prosecutor, William Welsh, by the way. A little bit of history of William Welsh. He was the head of the Office of Public Integrity. He was a team lead on the botched late Senator Ted Stevens case, in which he committed prosecutorial misconduct, framed, violations of Brady Giglio, okay? Let's just say, although much is actually sealed in my case, he engaged in the same practices in my own criminal case. So I knew that if I only relied, and at this point I was declared indigent before the court. I was now bankrupt. I was essentially broken. I had no money left. I had gone through every asset that I had. My private attorney, who would no longer represent me going forward pro bono, although he stayed on the case because, as he told the chief prosecutor, it was the right thing to do. He told me that from the time I was indicted to the point of public trial, the cost alone was at least $1 million and upwards of 2 or 3. I didn't have $1 million. I didn't have 500,000. Okay, I could mortgage my house and everything else that I had. I already had taken a second mortgage out of my home. Wouldn't come anywhere near the amount necessary to defend myself. And long story short, I was declared indigent before the court. No other attorneys came forward to represent me. Not even the civil rights, liberties, and rights groups you would have thought constituted rights groups that would have realized what was really going on. This is not just a bullseye on me and the war on whistleblowers, but also a bullseye on the First Amendment and the freedom of the press in this country. The foundational cornerstone of what it means to be American in this country. And so I faced a really grave situation. And all my criminal defense attorneys ended up being the federal public defenders for Maryland. They did an extraordinary job under incredibly constraining circumstances to deal with the Department of Justice leading the charge in the courtroom. So I knew I would have to influence, I knew I'd have to find some way. When I was indicted on 14 April 2010, I had to find some way to influence the court of public opinion. At the time, I just didn't know how. I just knew I would need to. Why? Because it'd be crucial. And I had history on my side with respect to the Pentagon Papers. I did. And although prosecutor's conduct in that case is ultimately what got that case tossed out, Ellsbury did go to trial. He was 4 months in. The last thing I wanted to do was actually go to trial, because trial would end up becoming just a circus. It would be a star chamber. The government has many, many arrows in its quiver. And so here's where, how do you make light of, how do you appeal to the public, to the people, as to what's at stake, zeroing in on the truth of my case?
And I want to just pause 1 second to discuss what Tom means when he says it would be a star chamber. When you charge a whistleblower under the Espionage Act, in Tom's case, for example, the government filed motions to preclude the mention of any whistleblowing, to preclude the mention of published newspaper articles, to preclude the mention of overclassification. The judge threw them out, thankfully, and one of the ones he threw out was the newspaper article one saying, well, how are you going to explain paragraphs 9 through 12 of your indictment that talk about newspaper articles if we can't mention them in the case? But I think what a trial looks like, it's not the public trial that you saw in To Kill a Mockingbird. That's not the trial we're talking about. It's done in secret. There's something called the silent witness rule. That means that the lawyers and the judge will talk in code, and the jury will understand it with a little cheat sheet, and the public will not be able to understand what's going on. The government seeks to withhold evidence from the defendant. They can use the laws for classification against the defendant by saying you can't see the evidence against you. you can't present the evidence. You can't present your evidence because it's classified, meaning that they can give a summary of it. So the defendant might only be able to present a summary of their evidence. The defendant's lawyers have to work in a government-controlled, sensitive, compartmented information facility. They actually built one just for Tom's case, which means that the defense lawyers have to work in a government-controlled facility. They can't take notes out. They have to write their briefs there. It's an extremely constrained environment. And there's no public interest defense. And in cases since Tom's, the judges' rulings in Espionage Act cases since Tom's have essentially said that the intent of the person doesn't really matter so much. So the fact that Tom and Chelsea Manning and John Kiriakou and Stephen Kim never intended to harm the United States, that will not get them innocence on an Espionage Act charge the way it really should. And in fact, the Espionage Act is so overbroad and poorly written that the seminal case evaluating it grafted an intent requirement onto it that wasn't written there to make it constitutional. Case law has since been abandoned somewhat to make it an extremely, extremely unfair situation when you try a whistleblower with a law that's meant for a spy. I'm sorry to take the stage from the experts here.
They actually argued that mere possession was intent alone, to disclose to an unauthorized person. It's important for you to know, in the narrative description of my indictment, that the damage I caused the national security of the United States was defined by the government as exceptionally grave. There is no higher form of damage. In fact, the chief prosecutor said that I was worse than a spy, because at least with a spy, secrets are given in secret to a spy or agents of a foreign power, where you are having it published through the press, and everybody gets to read it, including the spies.
No. Let me add something here. They're all forgetting one simple, straightforward order by the president, executive order. It's 13526. You can look it up on the web. Paragraph 1.7 says, you cannot use classification to cover up a crime, corruption, fraud, waste, or abuse, or illegality, plus a few other things. But those are the key ones. So the point is, they're violating their own executive, and that's the executive order that governs classification for the United States government. So they're violating their own orders in this charge.
So, Bill, I just wanted to ask you, since the revelations from Edward Snowden, how do you feel about the reaction from Congress and from the courts and from the press? Do you feel like things are changing and going in a good direction, or are we continuing heading down the dark path?
Well, I think they're starting to move in the right direction, but it's too slow for me. You know, I'm just a simple country boy. I like to go out and get the shovel and pitch it out, fix it right away, you know. Like, I believe, and I've been advocating this anyway, that we should have a constitutional convention for the states and make our own amendment to the Constitution, get it ratified by the states, and we could do this all without Washington, under Article 5 of the Constitution, by the way, where we would be able to do things like appoint a special prosecutor to go after everybody in Washington. None of them would be exempt. Also to do things like, say, be able to set up organizations that would investigate all these agencies, making sure that they're doing what they say they're doing, because they've been consistently lying to you. Especially the intelligence agencies, NSA and FBI and CIA, they're not audited. They don't tell you what they're doing, because what they're doing is you would not like at all. And so it would become an issue for you, and you could in turn get them. They should be indicted on a lot of things they're doing, and they're not. They're all covering it up for one another. So, but we, through Article 5 of the Constitution, get around that if we really had the will to make that happen.
Look, my saving grace was the press.
Yeah.
And the person who led an extraordinary defense in the court of public opinion was Jessalyn Radak. She's the director of the National Security and Human Rights Program at the Government Accountability Project, which Kathleen Mcclellan is the counsel.
behind the scenes and in front of the scenes, with mainstream media as well as alternative media. Eventually, between Jane Mayer's article in the New Yorker in May of 2011, Scott Pelley's interview with me and Bill and Kirk and Diane Rourke, the actual last 60 Minutes special, May 22nd of 2011, followed by two extraordinary, as well as a number of other publications. But even the Washington Post, the paper record in DC, right on the eve of my trial, had two extraordinary back-to-back blockbuster op-eds saying, you know what, government, maybe you are overreaching. Maybe he is a whistleblower, not a leaker. And oh, by the way, just in case you need to be reminded, we are the First Amendment. We do have an interest in what goes on inside the government. Because they were realizing, as late a date as that they were under direct threat. If you freeze the sources, particularly with respect to the national security side of the government, you freeze out sources, you censor and suppress. How else are you going to report the news? What are you left with? Government propaganda? You know, stenographers as mouthpieces of the government, just to parrot whatever they choose to share with the public, knowing that they can manipulate it. You know, what do? Are we supposed to destroy the Constitution in order to save the Republic? I don't think so. So I'm extraordinarily fortunate. I'm here on this stage as a free human being. The government in the end was never able to take away my freedom, my liberty, or my rights as guaranteed by the Constitution. But see, it was never about me in the end. Remember this thing, what are you willing to sacrifice? How precious is freedom and liberty to you? This may be an opportunity, Kathleen, for me to give all of you in the room a sense of what's at stake. Because one of the things we hear is, you know what, this surveillance stuff, what's the big deal? I have nothing to hide. Which means apparently you have nothing to fear. Do you know where that phrase came from? The phrase, you have nothing to fear if you have nothing to hide. One of the darkest chapters in the 20th century of the world's history. Joseph Goebbels, the Nazi minister of propaganda. The assumption is, because you don't have a choice, they're determining whether or not you have something to hide. So you have to make it all available. So if you truly have nothing to hide, and I'm a fellow American citizen, you can see me here on stage. You're also consenting adults, assuming you're 18. Then if you have nothing to hide, then why don't you just give me your car keys right now, and the keys to your apartment, and all the passwords to every account that you have, including Twitter, including Facebook, all your email, and all your medical records, and all your credit cards, and all your phone records. Just put them into a lockbox and give me the key, and I'll take care of them. Safekeeping. Are you going to do it?
Tom, the government told me you were a threat to national security, so I don't know if...
Well...
I mean,
Then give all your keys and all your passwords to Kathleen.
Oh.
She's an attorney. She'll protect it.
By all means, don't. I couldn't even drive my car here.
Will you?
But I think that's a very salient point, and I think it's also a point about the legality of what the government's doing. You know, a lot of what we hear is the government needs to do this surveillance for national security. And sometimes some very expert-sounding national security officials will get on TV and they'll say that. And it's very easy to believe and somewhat comforting. But at the same time, a lot of things would make it easier for law enforcement. I heard a very wise advocate once say, it would be very helpful for the FBI to have a key to everybody's house. So that if they ever need it, they could just go in and search. But they won't use it till they need it. Obviously, that's preposterous, but that's what we've essentially given NSA, is a key to all of your electronic information. And that's the problem. A lot of things might make it easier for the government to come after you if they decide to target you. It doesn't make them legal. I'm sorry, go ahead, Bill.
I was going to, that's a perfect takeoff on law enforcement. Because it's not just NSA, okay? NSA is the collector of the data. They're putting it in storage and indexing it and allowing it and setting up queries to go into it, like X-keyscore and things like that. But the users of it, the primary ones, are law enforcement. That's the FBI and the Drug Enforcement Agency And in Drug Enforcement Agency, they have a special operations division that they set up to specifically look into NSA data to see if they can find acts of, or evidence of a crime, and then they'll use that data against that individual to go arrest them, and they'll tip off state and local police to go arrest the person, and then when they get them to go into court, they can't take the NSA evidence in, you see, because it wasn't acquired with a warrant, and so therefore it can't be admissible in the court. So what they do is they do a parallel construction. And in that parallel construction, they do the normal procedures that they would use for police investigation. Go find after all, they know where the evidence is, right? So they'll use that to go directly to get it, get the warrants and get that data, and then substitute that for the NSA evidence that they used originally to arrest them, and put that into court. And they won't tell the judge, the prosecuting, defending attorneys, or any of them that they're doing this. Okay, so all this is kept secret from them. Well, I called that a planned program perjury policy run by our Department of Justice. Because that's what they're doing. They're perjuring themselves in court every time they do this. They're in fact corrupting and subverting our entire justice system. And this is what governments do when they have this kind of knowledge. And I'm reminded of another quote, and this comes back to what our government's been telling you over and over again. A quote by Adolf Hitler. He said, if you're going to tell a lie, make it a big one, tell it often, and eventually you'll get believed. And that's exactly what they're doing to you.
Look, they've interviewed former Stasi officers. And they said it's naive to assume that in collecting all of this data, that it's for your own good, it's for your own safety. They're collecting all this for control, using it for other purposes. And this is precisely what Bill is referring to as the other purposes for which the data will be used. It's the use of the data that actually ends up becoming its most egregious manifestation. When you hold this amount of data on people and you keep aggregating over time, the temptations are enormous, especially when you hold it in secret, to use it for other purposes. It becomes truly a threat, not just to democracy, but your individual sovereignty as a human being, because if they choose to come after you, if they decide to designate a group of people as subversive, or as dissidents, or as they label me an enemy of the state, they can make life extremely difficult for you. Look, whistleblowers are the canaries in the constitutional coal mine in the United States of America. We're saying that things aren't right. We're the people on the inside saying we have a problem here with what's going on inside government. But if there is a flaw in our special form of democracy, all forms of democracy, frankly, it's we the people. And so I want to go back to the preamble for a moment, because remember, all this is about, in the end, if there is no Constitution, we're not America. And I would argue, if you lose the First and Fourth Amendment, you fundamentally lose what it means to be an American. Just go back to the American Revolution. Go back to the Declaration of Independence and actually read what those usurpations of power were all about. We sometimes forget we had a violent revolution against a crown because people were showing up at the door with a piece of paper called a writ of assistance. They could take you, your home, and any of your effects and papers away, just on the basis of a piece of paper. There also were sweeping people up just by hanging out together or hanging out with the wrong crowd. The powers that the government has today are extraordinarily vast. We must rebind those powers with the chains of the Constitution, to re-paraphrase Thomas Jefferson. Because what's at stake is nothing less than our own sovereignty. So in the preamble of the Constitution, those extraordinarily powerful words, we the people. It's not we the government, it's not we the national security state, it's not we the deep state. It's we the people. What? In order to form a more perfect union. If that matters, the idea how to govern ourselves, with all the faults and the flaws that are in the Constitution, and many were built in from the start, it's still an extraordinary idea in how to govern ourselves. It's a grand experiment. I don't want to see that experiment end. And yet I also know that in terms of history, history's not kind when it comes to empires. And all empires end up in the dustbin of history. Are we truly any different as the American empire than all the other empires in history? We don't have any special exemption from history in this regard. But we do have a thing called the Constitution. I'd rather keep it around. I really would. That's why I took an oath to support and defend it. Are there any Star Trek fans out here? You remember the original series? The original cast? They started doing a series of movies starting in 1979. I believe it's 1982, the second movie came out called The Wrath of Khan. In that movie, Spock sacrifices his life for the sake of the crew of the Enterprise. And Kirk, his best friend, Captain Kirk, runs down to the engine room after Scotty says, "You got to get down here." He says, "Spock, why, Spock? Why?" And Spock, it's an incredibly powerful line. It's one of the most famous lines in Star Trek lore. Spock looks at him as he's dying, looks at Kirk, says, "The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few or the one." What are you willing to give up, willing to sacrifice? Are you willing to forsake our liberties, our freedoms, and our rights for the sake of security? Franklin warned the nation. You'll lose both.
I had a spin-off on Star Trek and NSA. I was likening NSA to the Borg collective, all sharing one brain cell.
Right.
So, but it means when you only have one brain cell, you can't set up a synaptic pattern, so you can't have a thought, you see.
Unimatrix 1.
Yeah, that's right. You see.
Unimatrix 1.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, on that note, I think we should open it up for questions.
Hi, thank you for great presentations. I'm Fulbright research scholar. I research the best practice and some mistakes in whistleblower protection for government transparency and accountability. I'm from Ukraine. So, several questions. What is your opinion? Has the Policy Directive 19 from President managed to create a strong mechanism for whistleblowers in intelligence community?
Okay, let's just do one so that everyone has a chance to ask.
Bill, go ahead.
Well, I believe it when I see it, okay? I simply don't trust anything our current government says.
I don't think anyone can blame you.
It's just a piece of paper. I mean, it was a bone. It was thrown. There's a massive cutout for anybody that's in a national security designated position that increasingly includes people that don't even require actual clearances to do their job. That was a bone. It was still left up to the individual agencies. I've called it a whistleblower exposure directive. Okay, it's not a protection, and it's not in law. I mean, this is really the president saying so. The other thing, by the way, and speaking of 19, I don't know why 19 seems to be a popular number. Clapper it turned out it was dated March 20th, but it became public through Steve Aftergood's secrecy project, FAS.org. ICD, Intelligence Community Directive 119, extraordinarily chilling. I'm calling it General Gag Order number 1, because it means that any intelligence community employee can be fired, let go, or put under criminal sanctions, criminal investigation, or worse, if they have contact with the media of any kind. Any kind. And it doesn't matter whether it's classified information or unclassified information, and it's the government that determines whether or not the information is government-related. Extraordinarily chilling.
Okay, yes. I think that Edward Snowden, or I know that he's an international hero. I hope someday he can return to this country as a national hero and be welcomed. I don't know if some of us will live to see that. Thank you for explaining why he had to leave the country. I want to say I know that Russia is not an easy place to live in a lot of ways, and I'd like to hear you comment on what I think are some pretty dire predictions for his personal future. And please comment about what he has given up as a young whistleblower. A lot of people don't seem to understand that he has paid a terrible price. And I'd like you to comment about that for this group.
Well, my impression basically is that he sacrificed his life to expose the threat to our democracy and our Constitution. And he basically gave up his whole life to do that.
And to the sovereign rights of citizens around the world.
Yes, right.
Remember, all human beings are born with inalienable rights. Amongst these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That's not just confined to U.S. citizens. I've met Edward Snowden. I went to Russia along with Jesselyn Radak, Colleen Rowley, and Ray McGovern. We presented him with the Sam Adams Associates Integrity and Intelligence Award. He realizes that his chances of returning to the United States, at least in these year or couple years under the current regime, are slim to none. And ironically enough, he never intended on going to Russia, living in Russia, or remaining in Russia. He was actually in transit, and the United States saw fit to revoke his passport. It makes it very difficult to travel. As I know, mine was confiscated. You can't travel very easily when you don't have a passport, especially when you're outside the confines of the United States. In spite of current world geopolitics, particularly what's going on in the Ukraine, Russia is one of the few nations in this world today that do not have an extradition treaty with the United States. And under international law, he's a designated asylee. He has temporary asylum granted by Russia. Russia is the host nation. Is living in Russia the ideal place? No. But where else could he go at this time? There are other countries that may have interest. There may be other possibilities, but right now, he's living in Russia. And he's safer there right now than anywhere else. But we have other Americans who essentially are exiled, like Laura Poitras, who will be receiving, as I did a couple of years ago, receiving with Edward Snowden, the Ridenour Truth-Telling Prize in D.C. next week.
I would just add, if anyone has a question about why Edward Snowden is in Russia, it should be addressed to the U.S. government. That's who put him there.
Yeah.
I've heard the name Snowden mentioned several times. I'd be most interested in your comments on Bradley Manning and Julian Assange.
Well, I consider Chelsea Manning a whistleblower, an extraordinary revelation about how far our American military foreign policy has gone, which I call the dark side of our policy, this power projection of empire. I know Julian Assange. I've met him a number of times in trips to England. An extraordinary individual, often caricaturized in the press. He is incredibly fearless. One of the few outlets that exist still in the world today that's willing to publish some of the most sensitive information about what's going on inside the halls of power, both government as well as corporations. But in so doing, he became a target. Right now, he's confined to just a few rooms in the embassy of Ecuador in London. That background I'm very familiar with, the Cypherpunk Manifesto. I cut my teeth in terms of the geek side of myself. Right? I'm like a geek right now and not wearing, I do have pens, but not pocket protectors.
You did mention Star Trek.
I did mention Star Trek. My first computer, by the way, was an Atari 8-bit, and that was during the 1980s, and that's actually when I was first introduced to the Chaos Computer Club in Germany. 300 baud modem, acoustic. I still love the sound.
We have one other question.
This is probably a pretty naive question, but I was just wondering, obviously we know that the government, all these corporations are in bed with one another, and it's all about the money and stuff like that. But what would stop, they were after you guys pretty hard and wanted to put you away for a long time. What would stop them from bribing the judge that handled your case, whether it be with money or something?
Yeah, nothing really, because all of this information about people, this is like J. Edgar Hoover on super steroids. They've got leverage on everybody. or at least if people think they do, if they don't really have it, they think they do because of all the collection of information that's going on. So that's really that like, for example, the leverage that George Bush would have against Nancy Pelosi about trying to impeach him. He'd have that leverage. That's the kind of thing they'd have on everybody, including judges and generals and House and Senate members, all of them.
And I wouldn't say we're there yet, but I think we've heard many whistleblowers use the term turnkey tyranny, and the system is in place that if somebody wants to start doing that sort of nefarious dictatorial behavior, the system is in place, and it's in secret, a lot of it, not as much now, thanks to the whistleblowers, but it's in place for someone to start doing that, and that's the problem.
Read Hannah Arendt's book on totalitarianism. You get mass surveillance is not about keeping you safe. Mass surveillance is not about protecting you from existential threats. It's ultimately about control, social control. That's clear. By the way, I'll just share with you, it gives me an opportunity to say this. I had an extraordinary conversation with a couple from Germany. Bill, myself, Justin Radak actually spoke at the Chaos Computer Club. They have a congress every year, and we spoke in December of 2012 in Hamburg, Germany. Had this extraordinary conversation, and they said, well, at least we know in Germany that we live in a post-fascist society. You live in a pre-fascist society in America and don't even know it. When you combine the extraordinary power of the government, especially in secret, you have an executive that has essentially unchained itself from the rule of law and the Constitution. You've militarizing much of the space under the commander-in-chief's power of Article 2 in the Constitution. You're marrying that to these incredibly secret arrangements and alliances with huge corporations. What form of governance is that? We don't use the F word here in this country.
Yeah.
But that's what it is.
Plus, I'd like to add one thing that's very analogous to that fascist state is the National Defense Authorization Act, Section 1021, where it authorized the president to declare somebody a terrorist threat or something and have the military incarcerate them and give them no due process and so on. That's very similar to Special Order 48 issued by the Nazis in 1933. Right after the Reichstag fire, and they used that as the pretext to do that, and then they got rid of all their political opponents using that order. Very analogous to that.
Yeah, I can't express how much I admire you, all three of you. Since our First, Fourth, and Eighth Amendments have been obliterated, how is it that the legal profession as an institution hasn't flown to your aid? Have they sold out just like our cowardly government?
I haven't sold out, but I'm pretty poor. I mean, I think the legal profession, I think part of it is, the government always seems to get the benefit of the doubt. And it's hard to understand why that is. They've lied, especially about surveillance, to the American people over and over and over again. But I think, with Bill and Tom, it took a really, really long time. And the legal profession, as a lawyer, you're part of the system. The rule of law is what your schooling is based on. You want the rule of law to work. You want the courts to work. And in fact, representing whistleblowers, and in particular national security whistleblowers, it can be incredibly frustrating because they don't have access to the courts. And they're being prosecuted, but they don't have access to defend themselves. They don't have a lawsuit to bring to get their jobs back. Or when the intelligence agency, or when the NSA started sandbagging all of Bill and Kirk's contracts, there's no lawsuit that they can bring. And so it is frustrating, but I think part of why you don't see the legal profession more involved is because the law doesn't really provide an avenue. And as a lawyer, sometimes you want to help everything about your client's life, but you really only have the law, and it doesn't help NSA whistleblowers, really.
Have they no recourse? Can't they sue the government for all the abuse and hell they sustain?
They can sue the government to get their computers back, which they're doing. Apparently, though, NSA is still reviewing the information, or they finally returned some of it after years.
Talking about the harassment and the hell they put them through.
There's no law. There's a constitutional claim that could conceivably be possible, but case law has made it so difficult that it's unlikely. There's a statute of limitations on that as well. There is no law protecting national security whistleblowers. They can't go to the Merit Systems Protection Board. They can't go. We tried to go to Congress. The response was sort of, sorry about that, and then silence. I mean, there is no law protecting them. And part of it also goes back to this concept of national security. When the executive says national security, for some reason the other branches of government roll over. The courts are very willing to accept what the government says is classified, and that goes for civil lawsuits challenging NSA surveillance. It goes for Tom Drake's criminal case. They are very willing to accept the government's claims of national security. And I think that is starting to change, and the courts are starting to step in. And I think thanks to Edward Snowden, there's lawsuits that can proceed now that were shut down before. But any change that's occurred in our society, the courts have always been sort of the last stamp. They were the last stamp on the civil rights movement. They didn't start it. And in the anti-surveillance movement, they're going to be the last stamp as well.
It's important for you to know only two people since 9/11 investigated, prosecuted, charged, indicted, and convicted for surveillance and torture. You're looking at one of them. I did not authorize surveillance. I did not engage in surveillance in violation of the Fourth Amendment and sovereign rights of citizens, but I was criminalized for having held the mirror about mass surveillance. The other person is John Kiriakou, currently serving 30 months in a federal penitentiary in Loretto, Pennsylvania. In fact, I could argue, as has his attorney and Kathleen, that if he had actually tortured, he refused the torture training, would not engage in torture. If he, in fact, had engaged in torture, he would not be in prison today.
He would actually have qualified immunity.
Now, what does that tell you in this country? This shows you extraordinarily powerful forces. And in terms of the Nuremberg principles, I think I recall having spoken to one of the attorneys at the Nuremberg trials that just because you follow orders, that doesn't give you the excuse as a defense. That's precisely what's happened. Because the executive issues orders, secret law, secret opinions, secret interpretations, that if you follow it, you're protected. But if you just expose it, you're criminalized.
Yep.
Yeah, I like the fact that you guys talk about, especially Nazi Germany, and just like Martin Luther King said, everything Hitler did in Germany was legal. Now, for in our Constitution, we have things like even what Thomas Jefferson said, that nullification is rightful remedy. What are your guys' views on nullification being used by the states? Like in the Bluffdale, Utah senator cutting off the water. That's types of nullification. What are your guys' views in the future of nullification in the United States?
That's why I was arguing for the Article 5 amendments to the Constitution, getting together as the states and the people and modifying the Constitution to be able to attack these people in D.C. and make them all exposed to the people coming down on them.
Well, I'm very aware of the con, and our kind of argument to the con is that if they're not following the laws that are on the books now, what's going to make them follow the new laws on the books? And that's that's why we're supposed to be a republic. That
well, see, part of the problem is you have to. Some of these laws need to be challenged, like the Patriot Act, as to the constitutionality of them. That's why I signed an affidavit for EFF lawsuit, Jewel versus NSA. That's still going in the courts, and it's challenging the constitutionality of NSA collecting all this data to begin with, not just the metadata, but also the content, which they're doing with the upstream program.
One weakness in nullification, you really have to go to trial.
Yeah.
So the jury can do the nullification, but the government does everything it can to actually avoid trial, as they did in my case as well. Because but part of this is they want to destroy. They know that by overreaching, by overcharging, especially with something as egregious as the Espionage Act, most people break. I realize, I'm very fortunate in that regard. So they ultimately don't. The chances of going to trial are slim to none. And with the exception, even the end, Chelsea Manning they finally got an Espionage Act charge to stick. But that was 35 years instead of 60, 70 plus.
But they didn't want to go to trial with him because then all the torture would come up.
Yes.
Well, yeah.
Doing us in, the
first
courage?
thing I told Jesselyn and Kathleen when we first met was that I would never commit suicide. So that they would know if something happened that it was not suicide.
Says it tongue-in-cheek, but he's very serious.
Because I knew some of the people who would do it.
It is not pleasant. It was the worst 5 years of my life. When you have the enormous resource the government may use against you. I had extraordinary electronic surveillance conducted on me. Extraordinary. I had physical surveillance. They used to park a couple of cars at the end of my road. In fact, the agent in charge, Paul Merrick, actually said, "Oh yeah, we knew everywhere you went, Mr. Drake. We knew when you left home. We know what vehicle you used. When you went to the grocery store." They were following me around. Okay? It does things to you. This is why we don't want our rest of the citizenry to live what we lived. We've already lived the surveillance state. It's not pleasant. It does strange things to you. I never felt the same in my own home again after you have the house tossed by a dozen agents. But one of the things, I was not going to let the government get to me. I was going to stand my ground when all else had left. Everything else had left. Friends, family, colleagues, all else had left, particularly in those really lonely months and years prior to the actual indictment. What else do you have left? Then you're facing the prospect of spending a huge amount of the rest of your life in prison. Let's just say you really begin to focus on what matters most in life. And those are the things that are most precious to who we are as human beings. If those things matter, we'll stand up for them. But I will tell you, we have a challenge as the people. I have great faith in the people. I truly do. But the one thing we have to face is many people that I used to know and work with will actually apologize to me. And they will say, "Tom, I understand what you went through. I actually agree with you. But I wouldn't do anything that you did." Why? And they even list it off. For those who've studied Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I've got a job. I've got a retirement. I've got a house. I've got a mortgage. I've got kids in college. I don't want to disturb that. That means they're willing to sacrifice a lot to keep themselves feeling safe and secure.
I think that's one of the things that we need to change about whistleblowers. You shouldn't have to sacrifice your car, your mortgage, your kids' college education, your home, your family, your freedom in order to expose what's clearly government illegality. And if whistleblowers had safe, effective internal channels that they could use, then there would not be a need for an Edward Snowden, and there would not be an Edward Snowden. And the other way for the government to quiet whistleblowers is to stop breaking the law and lying about it. Then they would not have anything to blow the whistle on.
Okay, I just wanted to say, I think it's a known fact that you can't throw a frog into boiling water and cook him. He'll jump right out. So what 9/11 created is a change in our culture. It created an environment that allowed small little infringements that we don't necessarily notice. And I'll use, say, employers checking your Facebook for employment as an example, that we don't necessarily look at and say, "Oh my God, wow," like we do with your stories. But how, once the damage has been done to our culture, do we then mitigate it? That's my question.
Well, we have to restore the heart of the American experience, and that's under the Constitution. And that's why I've asked for, we got to get back to at least 9/10. Because the trend lines, it's true, the trend lines aren't good. And are we willing as a nation to actually give up even more liberties and freedoms in this country because of technology, because the government can? I don't think so. I really don't. Otherwise, it fundamentally changes and alters who we are as a society. But you talk to people who, how many people, I'm just a show of hands here. How old were you? Were you less than 12 years old on 9/11? You only know what it's like to live in a post-9/11 society. There's a whole lot that we've lost just because of 9/11, and none of it was necessary. We didn't have to go this route, and yet we did. So we have to confront that stark reality. And the question I fundamentally leave, given that we're living examples of what happens to those who would dare speak truth to or of power, the fundamental question you have to ask yourself is, what future do you want to keep? That's back to we the people. If it matters enough to the people, guess what? You'll defend it. You'll support it. You'll advocate for it. I mean, I got people in my own circle who say, why are you bothered with all this, Tom? I mean, you've already sacrificed enough. Why do you? Because it matters. I don't want other people to go through what I've been through. I don't want whole populations or subpopulations or segments of the population being targeted. History's not kind here.
We're getting nearing the end. I was told 2:00, so one more question. Okay.
Thank you. Is this working? Yes. There's another whole world out there which is not governmental. There's a world that is supported by the government, but it's the mob or the mafia or whatever you might want to call it, which is under control of the government and does things. For example, right after 9/11, there were anthrax letters that were sent to legislators, members of Congress, and other people. Those letters were sent by a member of the mob in New England. If you notice the accent, I'm from Maine. And I know the man who sent those letters. I'm certain 100%. But what happens is the FBI or CIA or whatever organization comes along, they will try to pinpoint somebody else as a perpetrator of the anthrax letters in this case. Dr. Hatfield, Dr. Ivins, they did not send the anthrax letters. I know who it was. He was a notorious gangster in New England. I knew him for 7 years before I found out who he was. Perhaps some of you know Whitey Bulger, James Joseph Bulger. He sent the anthrax letters because I was involved, and I know about it. There's another aspect to what the government is doing, which is not governmental control, but it's control by the government of others who do things which I couldn't believe. You know, I tried to get Whitey Bulger in jail. Eventually, 10 years later, yes, he was arrested. But it meant that I was targeted 8 times for death. I've got a scar on my ear where a bullet went by, all due to not government agents, but the mob. So, yes. My question is, can I speak with Mr. Drake afterwards? I have some things that I'd like to talk to him about.
Okay, so I think that's not a question. There is, I want to tell all of you, I know all of you, there may be, most of you have questions. It doesn't end here. We have to vacate this venue. But all 3 of our guests are going to be upstairs in rooms 252 and 254. Right after this event, they're going to move on up there. If you want to continue to ask questions with Bill Binney, Tom Drake, and Kathleen Mcclellan, they will be available to you in a smaller venue. You'll be able to shake their hands, ask them questions, and meet them face to face. So thank you all for coming. Thank Kathleen, Tom Drake, and Binney. Please fill out your surveys and put them at the table out in the front of the venue.